Blood trickled down Elijah Thompson's uniform as he stood, fist clenched, staring at the unconscious white passenger. 20 pairs of eyes watched in shock. This decorated Air Force veteran turned pilot never imagined his final flight would end with handcuffs and his 30-year career destroyed. Before we dive into this shocking true story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about people standing up against discrimination. The airline industry has a history of racial inequality that few talk about, but Captain Thompson's story will show you what happens when someone finally says, enough. The shrill beep of the alarm clock pierced the darkness of Elijah Thompson's modest Atlanta apartment at precisely 4:30 a.m. After 30 years of early morning flights, his body automatically reached to silence it before his mind fully awakened. 62 years old with salt and pepper hair that had once been fully black, Elijah moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same routine thousands of times. As he showered, memories of his journey flashed through his mind. From 18-year-old Air Force recruit to becoming one of the few black commercial airline pilots at Atlantic Airways, every step had been an uphill battle. The military had been challenging but fair. The commercial aviation world had proven far more resistant to change. Elijah carefully trimmed his mustache, a holdover from his military days that he'd maintained with precision for decades. The face staring back at him in the mirror had aged well, though the lines around his eyes had deepened with each passing year of strain. Flying commercial aircraft was physically less demanding than fighter jets, but the emotional toll of constantly proving himself had left its mark. His phone rang as he was buttoning his crisp white uniform shirt. The name, Zara, flashed on the screen, bringing an immediate smile to his face. "Morning, baby girl," he answered, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder. "Dad. I caught you before you left. Just wanted to wish you luck on your second-to-last flight." His daughter's voice bubbled with excitement. At 34, Zara had followed in his footsteps, not into aviation but into breaking barriers as one of the few black female cardiothoracic surgeons at Johns Hopkins. "Thanks, sweetheart. Hard to believe the next one will be my last after all these years," Elijah replied, his deep voice warm with affection. "How are you feeling about it?" Zara asked, suddenly serious. Elijah paused, considering the question. "Mixed emotions. Proud of what I've accomplished. Frustrated at what hasn't changed." "You mean like being passed over for chief pilot 3 times despite having the most experience?" Zara had always been direct, a quality Elijah had instilled in her. "Among other things," he acknowledged. "Last month they promoted Lawrence Reed, good pilot, half my experience. When I asked why, they said he fit the leadership image they wanted to project." "That's code for white," Zara huffed. "You said it, not me," Elijah chuckled, though the humor didn't reach his eyes. "Anyway, it's almost over. 2 more flights and I can stop fighting these battles." After promising to call her after landing in San Francisco, Elijah hung up and moved to the small alcove that served as his home office. There, prominently displayed, was a photo of Diana, his late wife. 10 years gone from breast cancer, but her presence still filled the apartment. "Almost done, Dee," he whispered, touching the frame gently. "You always said I'd change things just by being there. Sometimes I wonder if it was enough." 45 minutes later, Elijah navigated through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with practiced ease. He couldn't help but notice what he always did, how the demographics shifted as he moved from the general terminal areas toward the crew lounges and operations centers. The passengers and public-facing staff reflected Atlanta's diverse population, but the pilot's lounge looked like it was stuck in the 1960s. "Morning, Captain Thompson," called Gabriela Rivera, the flight attendant who would be working first class on today's flight. At 36, she was relatively senior among the cabin crew, having fought her own battles as a Latina woman in the industry. "Gabriela, good to see you again," Elijah smiled genuinely. They had flown together often enough to develop a friendly rapport based on mutual respect. "Second to last flight, right?" "The crew's planning something for your retirement next week," she said with a wink. "Nothing too embarrassing, I hope," he chuckled. Gabriella's expression turned more serious. "Heard about Reed getting chief pilot?" Elijah shrugged. "It is what it is." "It's bull, is what it is," she replied firmly. "You know, in 10 years at Atlantic, I've reported 17 incidents of passenger harassment. The white attendants get immediate support. I get asked what I did to provoke it." "Same story, different department," Elijah nodded. "That's why I made sure Zara went into medicine instead of following me here. At least there, merit still counts for something." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Lawrence Reed, Elijah's co-pilot for the day's flight. At 45, Reed was significantly younger than Elijah, with the golden boy good looks of a pilot from a recruitment poster. Their relationship was professionally cordial but complicated by Reed's recent promotion over Elijah. "Thompson, Rivera," Reed acknowledged them with a nod. "Flight plan's been filed. Full passenger load today." "Morning, Lawrence," Elijah responded evenly. "I was just heading to do the walk-around inspection." As they parted ways, Elijah felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders. He and Reed had flown together for nearly 8 years. The younger pilot was competent, though sometimes overconfident. What bothered Elijah wasn't Reed's promotion itself but knowing that Reed had never had to consider how his race affected his career trajectory. During pre-flight checks in the cockpit, the routine of switches, gauges, and system verifications provided the familiar comfort of technical precision. Flying had always been Elijah's escape. In the air, physics didn't care about the color of your skin. His mind wandered to his pending retirement. He'd missed the feeling of guiding these massive machines safely through the skies. He wouldn't miss the subtle indignities, passengers doing double takes upon seeing him in the captain's chair, junior white pilots questioning his decisions, the careful way he had to modulate his tone to avoid being labeled aggressive. One of Elijah's favorite parts of any flight was greeting passengers from the cockpit door as they boarded. Today, as Atlantic Airways Flight 1382 to San Francisco began boarding, he stood at his post, welcoming travelers with a warm smile. "Good morning, welcome aboard," he repeated, making eye contact with each person who passed. As the first-class cabin filled, Elijah noticed something unusual. Among the 16 first-class passengers, 7 were black. There was what appeared to be a family of 3, a distinguished older gentleman with silver temples. 2 women in corporate attire engaged in quiet business discussion, and a man about Elijah's age wearing an Air Force veteran cap. The sight gave Elijah a momentary surge of pride. When he'd started flying commercial routes in the early 1990s, he could go months without seeing another black person in first class. Today's diverse cabin represented progress, however incremental. He exchanged a knowing glance with the Air Force veteran, who offered a subtle nod of recognition. Returning to the cockpit to complete final preparations, Elijah felt a complicated mix of emotions. The changes he was witnessing were real, but they had come so slowly. As retirement approached, he wondered what legacy he was leaving behind. Had his presence in the cockpit for 3 decades helped move the needle at all? Or was he simply vacating a seat that would likely be filled by another white pilot? Reed interrupted his thoughts, reviewing the flight plan for their 5-hour journey to San Francisco. Outside the cockpit windows, Atlanta's summer humidity created a slight haze over the tarmac as ground crews finished loading luggage. In 30 minutes, they'd be above the clouds, where the view was always clear. If only, Elijah thought, the path forward for those following in his footsteps could be equally unobstructed. Atlantic Airways Flight 1382 was nearly ready for departure. The boarding process had gone smoothly, and Gabriella had just informed the cockpit that they were only waiting on one final passenger before they could close the main cabin door. Elijah and Lawrence were completing their final pre-departure checklist when they heard a commotion near the entrance. Benjamin Maxwell strode onto the aircraft like a man accustomed to making entrances. At 58, Maxwell was the picture of corporate success. Expensive tailored suit, designer watch glinting on his wrist, and the confident bearing of someone rarely told no. His silver hair was immaculately styled, and his tanned skin suggested recent leisure time in exclusive locales. Finally, he announced to no one in particular, loud enough for his voice to carry throughout the first-class cabin. Traffic was abysmal. You'd think they'd coordinate construction projects better around the airport. Gabriella approached him with professional courtesy. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Maxwell. Let me show you to your seat." Maxwell barely acknowledged her, his attention suddenly caught by the demographic makeup of the first-class cabin. His expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight downward turn of the mouth. He followed Gabriella to his assigned seat, 2D, an aisle seat in the second row. "Is something wrong, sir?" Gabriella asked, noticing his hesitation. "No, nothing," Maxwell replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. As he settled into his seat, he immediately pressed the call button. Gabriella returned promptly. "How may I help you, Mr. Maxwell?" "I'd like a scotch." "Neat. Something decent, not the well stuff," he demanded, still scanning the cabin with poorly concealed disapproval. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't serve alcohol until we're airborne and the captain has turned off the fasten seatbelt sign," Gabriella explained politely. Maxwell sighed dramatically. "Fine. Sparkling water then. With lime." In the cockpit, Elijah could hear snippets of the exchange through the partially open door. He had encountered passengers like Maxwell throughout his career, men who viewed their first-class tickets as entry fees to an exclusive club that should cater to their every whim and, more troublingly, maintain a certain standard of clientele. What Elijah couldn't know was the extent of Maxwell's connections to Atlantic Airways. As CEO of Maxwell Development Group, a commercial real estate empire with properties in 15 states, Benjamin Maxwell had cultivated relationships with several Atlantic Airways board members. His company provided office space for 2 of the airline's regional headquarters, and he personally played golf with Richard Blackwell, the airline's CEO, twice monthly at their shared country club. Back in the cabin, Maxwell's attention had shifted to the temperature. "It's sweltering in here," he complained as Gabriella returned with his sparkling water. "Can't you adjust the air conditioning?" "The auxiliary power unit is running at maximum cooling, sir," Gabriella explained. "Once we're in the air, the temperature will normalize quickly." Maxwell took a sip of his water and grimaced. "This isn't Pellegrino. We serve Perrier on domestic flights, sir." Maxwell grunted disapprovingly. His gaze landed on Dr. Tamara Washington, a black woman in her early 40s seated across the aisle in 2C. She was reviewing medical charts on her tablet, completely absorbed in her work. "Excuse me," Maxwell called to Gabriella, who was assisting another passenger. When she approached, he lowered his voice but remained audible to those nearby. "Is first class overbooked today? Seems unusually crowded." Gabriella maintained her professional smile. "All passengers in first class today have first-class tickets, sir." Maxwell's implication was clear, and Dr. Washington, despite appearing focused on her tablet, had heard every word. She glanced up briefly, made eye contact with Maxwell, then returned to her work without commenting. Not deterred, Maxwell continued his subtle campaign of complaints. When the older black gentleman with silver temples in row 1 reclined his seat slightly during the prolonged ground delay, Maxwell immediately called Gabriella over. "The gentleman in front of me has his seat reclined before takeoff." "Isn't that against regulations?" he asked, loud enough for others to hear. Gabriella approached the passenger in 1D. "Sir, we do ask that all seats remain in their upright position for takeoff." The man, Judge William Foster as Elijah would later learn, apologized and adjusted his seat. He turned slightly, glancing at Maxwell with the measured assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating character in his professional capacity. Air traffic delays kept the aircraft at the gate for an additional 20 minutes, during which Maxwell's behavior grew increasingly irritating to those around him. He repeatedly checked his watch, sighing loudly, and made a show of important emails he needed to send before this flight finally decides to leave. When Dr. Washington received a glass of water without having to request it, Gabriella recognized her from previous flights. Maxwell's face darkened. "Interesting how some passengers seem to get preferential treatment," he remarked to no one in particular. The comment hung in the air, creating a palpable tension. "Dar." Washington set down her tablet and turned toward Maxwell. "I fly this route twice monthly for surgical consultations at UCSF Medical Center," she explained calmly. "The crew recognizes many regular passengers and their preferences. I'm sure they'd be happy to anticipate your needs as well once they become familiar with them." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "I've been an executive platinum member for 15 years. I shouldn't need to establish familiarity." "Dar." Washington smiled politely and returned to her tablet, choosing not to escalate the situation. But Maxwell wasn't finished. He beckoned Gabriella again. "Could you verify that everyone in first class today is supposed to be here? Seems there might have been some confusion with the boarding passes." This request, clearly targeted at the black passengers, crossed a line that even Gabriella's professional training couldn't ignore. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Sir, all passengers have been properly checked in and are seated in their assigned seats. Is there a specific concern you have about your own seat assignment?" "No, just making sure everything is in order," Maxwell replied, the implication hanging heavily in his words. In the cockpit, Elijah was aware of the increasing tension in the cabin but forced himself to focus on the departure preparations. A memory surfaced from early in his career. A similar passenger had made racist comments about him within earshot, and Elijah had remained silent, prioritizing his precarious position as one of the few black pilots at the airline. The regret of that silence had stayed with him. As they finally received clearance to push back from the gate, Elijah could feel the weight of more than just the aircraft under his command. Something told him this flight would test more than just his piloting skills. It would test his resolve as a man who had spent a career navigating the treacherous intersection of professional responsibility and personal dignity. Have you ever witnessed someone's true character reveal itself at 36,000 feet? There's nowhere to escape, nowhere to hide when tensions rise in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. If you've experienced or witnessed discrimination while traveling, comment number 1. If you believe pilots should stay out of passenger disputes, comment number 2. Like and subscribe to follow this story to its shocking conclusion. Now, what happens when a passenger's racism can no longer be ignored? And what would you do if you were in Captain Thompson's position? Once Flight 1382 reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Gabriella began the first-class beverage service. Maxwell immediately ordered the scotch he'd been denied earlier, specifying an 18-year-old single malt. When informed that the airline stocked only 12-year Macallan, he made a show of reluctantly accepting the inferior option. "Double pour to make up for the quality," he instructed, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. By his third scotch, Maxwell's behavior had deteriorated from subtly inappropriate to overtly problematic. His voice grew louder, his comments more direct. When the black family in row 3, a father, mother, and their teenage son, engaged in conversation about the boys' college visits to Stanford and Berkeley, Maxwell turned in his seat. "Lot of schools offering scholarships these days," he remarked with exaggerated knowingness. "Good time to be applying, especially for certain students." The father, Vernon Wilson, a telecommunications executive as Elijah would later learn, met Maxwell's gaze steadily. "Our son has a 4.2 GPA and perfect SAT scores. He'll have his choice of schools based on merit." Maxwell raised his glass in mock salute. Of course. Just making conversation." As Gabriella passed with the meal cart, Maxwell grabbed her wrist to get her attention, a boundary violation she experienced far too often from certain passengers. "The standard seemed to have really changed around here," he said, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "There are too many black people in first class these days. Back when flying was civilized, you knew what to expect up front." Gabriella gently but firmly removed his hand from her wrist. "Sir, that comment is inappropriate. Atlantic Airways values all its passengers." Dr. Washington, who had overheard the exchange, calmly closed her tablet and turned to face Maxwell directly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice measured but firm. "I couldn't help overhearing your comment. Perhaps you're unaware, but what you've just said is both offensive and factually incorrect. The demographics of first-class cabins are simply beginning to reflect the diversity of professional achievement in America. Nothing has been lowered except, perhaps, the tolerance for outdated attitudes." Maxwell's face flushed. "I wasn't talking to you. You were speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear," Dr. Washington replied. "Which suggests you either wanted an audience or didn't consider how your words might impact those around you." Several passengers were now openly watching the exchange. The Air Force veteran in 5A had removed his headphones. Judge Foster in 1D had turned completely around in his seat. The Wilson family in row 3 sat in uncomfortable silence. "This is ridiculous," Maxwell scoffed. "Can't even make an observation these days without someone turning it into a whole thing." "Some observations are better left unspoken," Dr. Washington countered. "Particularly those rooted in assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces." Maxwell's face darkened. "I've been flying first class since before you were born, sweetheart. I think I know what belongs." The condescension in Maxwell's tone triggered a memory for Elijah, who could hear the exchange clearly from the cockpit. 20 years earlier, a passenger had complained about being seated next to one of them and asked a flight attendant if he could move. The flight attendant had looked to Elijah, then a young first officer, with uncertainty. Elijah had said nothing, watching as the passenger was accommodated with a seat change. The shame of his silence had lingered long after the flight ended. In the present, Gabriella attempted to de-escalate the situation. "Sir, I need to continue with the meal service. Can I bring you something to eat?" Maxwell waved her away dismissively. "I've lost my appetite. But I would like to speak to the captain. I happen to know Richard personally." The implication that he was on a first-name basis with the CEO was clear. Dr. Washington returned to her tablet, though her rigid posture indicated the exchange was far from forgotten. Other passengers exchanged glances, the cabin atmosphere now thick with tension. In the cockpit, Elijah faced a decision. FAA regulations permitted pilots to leave the cockpit during cruise portions of the flight for physiological needs, but addressing passenger disputes was generally left to cabin crew. However, as captain, he was ultimately responsible for safety and order on his aircraft. "Situations getting heated back there," Elijah commented to Lawrence. Lawrence shrugged. "Cabin crew can handle it. That's what they're trained for." "Sounds targeted." "Racial," Elijah added, studying his co-pilot's reaction. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably. "People say all kinds of things on planes. Altitude, alcohol, delayed flights, best not to take it personally." The ease with which Lawrence dismissed the situation revealed the gulf in their experiences. For Lawrence, a passenger's racist remarks were an abstract inconvenience. For Elijah, they represented a concrete reminder of barriers he'd faced his entire career. FAA guidance is clear on passenger intimidation and harassment, Elijah noted. Captain has final authority. Before Lawrence could respond, there was a knock at the cockpit door. Following security protocol, Elijah checked the video monitor before unlocking it. Gabriella stood outside, her professional composure slightly frayed. "Captain Thompson," she began once the door opened slightly, "we have a situation in first class. A passenger is making explicitly racist comments and demanding to speak with you." He claims to personally know CEO Blackwell. Maxwell in 2D. Elijah confirmed. Gabriella nodded. He's now filming the interaction on his phone and threatening to call the corporate office from the airphone. Several passengers are becoming upset, on both sides. Both sides? Elijah inquired. Most seem uncomfortable with his behavior, but a couple appear to agree with him. One passenger in 4B suggested that certain people are too sensitive. Elijah processed this information quickly. The situation was escalating beyond a simple passenger complaint. If left unaddressed, it could potentially compromise cabin safety. I'll come take a look, he decided. Standard cockpit protocol. You'll remain here while I'm gone, he instructed Lawrence, who nodded somewhat reluctantly. As Elijah prepared to exit the cockpit, Lawrence spoke up. Elijah, just keep it professional, alright? Guy might be a jackass, but he's got connections. 2 more flights and you're done. Don't give them a reason. The warning was well-intentioned but revealing. Lawrence, despite years working alongside Elijah, still didn't fully grasp what, keeping it professional, had cost his black colleague over decades. The constant calculation. The swallowed responses. The dignity traded for security. I'm always professional, Elijah replied evenly. That's how I've survived 30 years in this industry. With those words, he unlocked the cockpit door and stepped into a confrontation that would test the boundaries of his professionalism in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Do you think Captain Thompson should confront the racist passenger directly or handle it through the cabin crew? Comment number 1 if you believe he should take direct action, or number 2 if you think he should stay in the cockpit. Like and subscribe to see how this tense situation unfolds. What would you risk to stand up against discrimination? And how far will Maxwell go to assert his perceived superiority? Following established protocol for pilots leaving the cockpit during flight, Elijah ensured Lawrence had control of the aircraft and that Gabriella would remain outside the cockpit door during his absence. The heavy door locked automatically behind him as he stepped into the forward galley. Where is he? Elijah asked Gabriella quietly. 2D, aisle seat, she confirmed. Dr. Washington in 2C has been the main target of his comments, along with general remarks about the number of black passengers in first class. Elijah nodded and straightened his uniform jacket. After 30 years and thousands of flights, he knew how to project authority, shoulders back, expression neutral but firm, voice modulated to command respect without aggression. Every black professional man learned these adjustments early or suffered the consequences of being labeled threatening. As Elijah entered the first-class cabin, several passengers noticed him immediately. Judge Foster gave an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The Wilson family watched with cautious attention. Dr. Washington looked up from her tablet with a mixture of surprise and interest. Maxwell, however, didn't immediately register Elijah's presence. He was typing furiously on his phone, muttering about documenting this entire ridiculous situation. Elijah approached and stood beside row 2, his posture professional but not confrontational. Good afternoon, sir. I understand there's a concern I might be able to address. Maxwell looked up, clearly expecting to see a flight attendant. His expression shifted to one of momentary confusion upon seeing Elijah's pilot uniform, then settled into something resembling annoyance. I asked to speak with the captain, Maxwell stated dismissively, returning to his phone. I'm Captain Thompson, Elijah replied evenly. I command this aircraft. Maxwell's head snapped up, genuine surprise registering on his face as he took in Elijah's 4 captain stripes and Atlantic Airways wings. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, his assumption that the captain would be white so ingrained that he hadn't considered alternatives. The silence lasted only seconds before Maxwell recovered. Well, Captain, he said, emphasizing the title with a hint of skepticism, I've been an executive platinum member with this airline for 15 years, and I've never seen such a decline in standards. What standards are you referring to, sir? Elijah asked, though he knew perfectly well what Maxwell meant. "The clientele," Maxwell replied, gesturing vaguely around the cabin. "The atmosphere. The overall experience has been diluted." "I see," Elijah responded. "And how would you suggest we improve this experience?" The question was a calculated one. Elijah was giving Maxwell enough rope to either pull himself to safety or hang himself with his own words. Maxwell leaned forward slightly. "Look, I know Richard Blackwell personally. We play golf together twice a month at Peachtree Hills. There was a time when first class meant something. When it was exclusive. All passengers in this cabin have first-class tickets, sir," Elijah stated, echoing Gabriella's earlier response. "That's not what I mean, and you know it," Maxwell snapped, his voice rising. "Since when does a pilot get involved in seating arrangements anyway? Isn't there someone more qualified handling these issues?" The implication that Elijah wasn't qualified for his position, a position he'd held with an impeccable safety record for over 20 years, was unmistakable. It was a familiar suggestion, one he'd heard in various forms throughout his career, that his presence in the cockpit was due to something other than merit. As Elijah maintained his composed exterior, his mind flashed back to his early days in the Air Force, where he'd encountered similar attitudes. His squadron commander, a tough but fair man named Colonel Harris, had given him advice that had shaped his approach. "They'll question your right to be here until you prove beyond any doubt that you belong. Then they'll question how you got so good. You can't win their game, so play your own." Dr. Washington, who had been observing the exchange silently, spoke up. "Captain, as a frequent flyer on this route, I want to commend Atlantic Airways on its excellent service and inclusive atmosphere. Some of us appreciate the progress." Maxwell shot her a venomous look. "No one asked for your input." "Actually," Elijah interjected, his voice still measured but with an unmistakable firmness, "all passenger feedback is valuable to us. Atlantic Airways strives to provide a respectful environment for everyone on board." "Respectful?" Maxwell scoffed. "What about respect for loyal customers who've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars with this airline? Who built the businesses that keep airlines like this afloat? Does loyalty count for nothing now? Loyalty is valued, Mr. Maxwell," Elijah assured him. "As is dignity and basic human respect for all our passengers, regardless of their appearance or background." Maxwell's face flushed deeper. "This is absurd. I made a simple observation about changes I've noticed. If certain people can't handle straightforward comments without turning it into a racial issue, that's not my problem." The cabin had grown silent, with all attention focused on the confrontation. Even passengers who had been attempting to ignore the situation were now watching openly. Elijah was acutely aware that his response in this moment would send a message, not just to Maxwell, but to everyone observing. "Mr. Maxwell," Elijah began, his deep voice steady, "I've been with Atlantic Airways for 28 years. I've seen many changes in our industry. The one I'm most proud of is that our cabins increasingly reflect the diverse tapestry of talent, achievement, and humanity that makes up our country. Every passenger here earned their seat, just as I earned my position in that cockpit, through hard work, dedication, and excellence." Maxwell's expression darkened further. "You're making a big mistake. One call to Richard, and we'll see who's still employed tomorrow. Some people simply don't understand their place in the natural order of things." The threat hung in the air, naked and ugly. Elijah felt a familiar calculation begin in his mind, the weighing of principles against pragmatism that had governed so many of his professional decisions. With retirement just 2 flights away, the prudent choice was clear: de-escalate, return to the cockpit, finish this flight without incident, and walk away from the industry with his pension intact. But as he stood there, Elijah noticed a young black boy watching intently from row 3. The Wilsons' teenage son. The boy's eyes were fixed on Elijah, waiting to see what this uniformed captain, this symbol of achievement, would do when faced with the same kind of bigotry the boy had likely already encountered in his young life. In that moment, the calculation shifted. What message would his silence send to that young man? What would it say about the cost of success? About which indignities must be tolerated to preserve one's position? About whether things had really changed at all? "Mr. Maxwell," Elijah said, his decision made, "there is indeed a natural order on this aircraft. As captain, I'm responsible for the safety and well-being of everyone aboard. That includes ensuring a respectful environment free from harassment or intimidation. Your comments have made several passengers uncomfortable and constitute a violation of our passenger code of conduct." Maxwell's mouth opened in disbelief. "You're lecturing me about conduct? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are, sir," Elijah replied steadily. "You're a passenger on my aircraft who is currently disrupting the cabin environment. I'm asking you, respectfully, to moderate your tone and comments for the remainder of this flight. If you have concerns about Atlantic Airways policies, customer service will be happy to address them upon our arrival in San Francisco." The directness of Elijah's response seemed to momentarily stun Maxwell. Several passengers, including Judge Foster and Dr. Washington, nodded in approval. But Maxwell wasn't finished. "I will not be spoken to this way," he declared, unbuckling his seatbelt and standing up, despite the aircraft experiencing light turbulence. "I demand to speak to someone else in authority. Someone who understands customer relations." Elijah remained calm but firm. "Sir, please return to your seat. The seatbelt sign has been reactivated due to turbulence." "Not until this situation is properly addressed," Maxwell insisted, swaying slightly as the aircraft encountered another patch of rough air. The confrontation had reached a critical juncture. Elijah had made his stand for dignity and respect, but Maxwell seemed determined to escalate further. Whatever happened next would have consequences that would extend far beyond Flight 1382. For the passengers witnessing this moment, for Atlantic Airways, and most immediately, for Elijah Thompson's 3-decade career. Maxwell stood unsteadily in the aisle, his face flushed with a combination of alcohol and indignation. The aircraft experienced another bump of turbulence, causing him to grip the headrest of Dr. Washington's seat to maintain his balance. "Sir, for your safety, I need you to return to your seat immediately," Elijah reiterated, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a captain who had navigated countless challenging situations. "Don't tell me what to do," Maxwell responded, taking a step closer to Elijah, deliberately invading his personal space. "I've been flying first class since you were probably cleaning planes. I know my rights." The cabin had fallen completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of the aircraft seemed to recede as passengers watched the confrontation unfold. Gabriella appeared at the forward galley, alerted by the escalating situation, and signaled to her colleague in the main cabin to come forward as well. "Mr. Maxwell," Elijah said, standing his ground without retreating or advancing, "this isn't about rights. It's about safety regulations and respectful conduct. Please return to your seat." Maxwell jabbed a finger toward Elijah's chest, stopping just short of making contact. "You people always hide behind regulations when you want to assert authority you haven't earned. I want your employee number. Richard will be very interested to hear about this." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air like a toxic cloud. There was no ambiguity about what Maxwell meant, and several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Washington's expression hardened, and Vernon Wilson placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened, and Lawrence emerged, breaking protocol. Pilots were never supposed to leave the cockpit unattended, but the raised voices had clearly alarmed him. "Everything all right out here?" Lawrence asked, his eyes moving between Elijah and Maxwell. "Your colleague here is overstepping his authority," Maxwell declared triumphantly, clearly relieved to see a white face in a position of power. "I've been a loyal customer for 15 years, and I'm being harassed for making a simple observation about the changing demographics of first class. Lawrence looked uncertainly at Elijah. "What's going on?" Before Elijah could respond, Judge Foster stood up from his seat in 1D. At 72, William Foster carried himself with the dignified bearing of his 28 years on the federal bench. "What's going on," Foster interjected, "is that this gentleman has been making increasingly racist comments throughout the flight, culminating in objections about too many black people in first class." When Captain Thompson appropriately addressed the situation, this passenger became belligerent and is now refusing to comply with safety instructions. Maxwell turned to Foster with contempt. "No one asked for your opinion either, old man." "Actually," Foster replied calmly, "as a retired federal judge who spent nearly 3 decades presiding over civil rights cases, I believe my assessment of discriminatory behavior might be relevant." Maxwell's face registered shock at learning Foster's former position, but he quickly recovered. "This is ridiculous. I'm being ganged up on for expressing a legitimate customer service concern." The aircraft encountered another patch of turbulence, more significant this time. Maxwell stumbled, bumping into Foster and pushing the older man aside in his attempt to regain balance. "Watch it!" Foster exclaimed, steadying himself against the bulkhead. "Then get out of my way," Maxwell retorted. The physical contact, however accidental, changed the dynamic instantly. Elijah stepped forward, his priority now protecting passengers from a potentially volatile situation. "Sir, return to your seat immediately," he ordered, no longer making a request. Maxwell, unbalanced by both alcohol and the aircraft's movement, suddenly lost his footing completely as the plane hit an air pocket. He fell against Elijah, then crashed to the floor of the aisle. As he scrambled to get up, his face now bright red with humiliation and anger, he shouted, "He pushed me. The captain pushed me." The accusation was absurd. Everyone in the cabin had seen Maxwell fall due to turbulence. But Maxwell seemed determined to create a narrative that positioned him as the victim. "This is assault," Maxwell continued, clambering to his feet. "I want him arrested when we land." The situation was spiraling out of control. Passengers were now visibly alarmed, with several reaching for their phones to record the confrontation. Gabriella and her colleague moved to position themselves between Maxwell and other passengers, creating a buffer zone. Lawrence, still standing in the cockpit doorway, looked completely out of his depth. "Elijah, maybe we should, this plane is being hijacked," Maxwell suddenly shouted, lunging toward the cockpit door. "He's taking control of the aircraft." The word hijacked triggered an immediate response throughout the cabin. A passenger in the main cabin who had heard the commotion screamed. Another passenger reached for the emergency call button. Lawrence instinctively moved to block the cockpit entrance. In the chaos, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the noise. "Federal Air Marshal. Everyone freeze." Diane Chen had been seated in 6C, observing the situation as it developed. Now she stood in the aisle, badge displayed, her posture and expression leaving no doubt about her authority. "Sir," she addressed Maxwell directly, "I've witnessed this entire incident. You need to return to your seat immediately. This is a direct order from a federal officer." Maxwell stared at Chen in disbelief, then at the badge she held. "You're not, you can't be. I am Air Marshal Diane Chen, and you are creating a level 4 disturbance on this aircraft. Return to your seat now, or I will restrain you." Maxwell's alcohol-impaired mind seemed to struggle with this new development. An Asian American woman as a federal air marshal didn't fit his worldview any better than a black pilot. "This is a setup," he declared. "You're all in on this together." Chen's expression remained impassive. "Sir, this is your final warning. Seat. Now." Instead of complying, Maxwell made a fatal error in judgment. He attempted to push past Chen toward the cockpit, shouting, "I need to call the real authorities." Chen's response was swift and decisive. With practiced efficiency, she executed a restraint maneuver that brought Maxwell to the floor, securing his hands behind his back with plastic restraints from her carry-on bag. "Captain," Chen addressed Elijah, "this passenger is now in custody for interfering with flight crew and making false claims of hijacking. I'll need to file an in-flight incident report, and I recommend diverting to the nearest suitable airport for law enforcement handoff." The situation had officially escalated from a passenger complaint to a security threat requiring emergency protocols. Elijah nodded to Chen, then turned to Lawrence. "Get back to the cockpit. We need to notify air traffic control and company dispatch." As Lawrence hurried to comply, Elijah addressed the visibly shaken passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a security situation that is now under control. For safety reasons, we'll be diverting to Denver International Airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We'll provide more information as it becomes available." From the floor where he was restrained, Maxwell continued to shout threats. "You're all finished. Do you hear me? I'll own this airline when I'm done. Richard will have your jobs." Chen calmly recited Miranda rights to Maxwell as Gabriella moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and providing reassurance. Dar. Washington was already helping an elderly passenger who appeared distressed by the commotion, while Judge Foster was explaining the legal situation to those nearby. Elijah returned to the cockpit, where Lawrence was already on the radio with air traffic control, requesting priority handling for their diversion to Denver. As he settled back into the captain's seat and took control of the aircraft, Elijah was acutely aware that Atlantic Airways headquarters was now being notified of the situation. Within minutes, CEO Richard Blackwell would learn that his golf partner had been restrained on one of his aircraft after making racist comments and falsely claiming a hijacking. The political and corporate calculations were already beginning. Blackwell would have to decide where his loyalties lay. With his social connection or with the legal and ethical standards of his airline. As Elijah programmed the new flight plan into the aircraft's computer, he knew that whatever happened next would determine not just the final chapter of his own career, but potentially the culture of Atlantic Airways itself. The line had been drawn, and there would be no going back to the days of silent accommodation. Have you ever witnessed justice being served at 37,000 feet? What would you do if you were on this flight? Stay silent or speak up against discrimination? Comment number 1 if you believe Captain Thompson made the right decision, or number 2 if you think he should have handled things differently. Like and subscribe to see the shocking aftermath of this in-flight confrontation. Will Maxwell's connections save him from consequences? And what price will Captain Thompson pay for standing up for what's right? In the cockpit of Flight 1382, Elijah worked with focused precision as he prepared for the emergency landing in Denver. His hands moved confidently across the controls, 30 years of experience evident in every deliberate action. Despite the unprecedented stress of the situation, his exterior remained calm, a necessary skill for any pilot, but one that black professionals like Elijah had to master in every aspect of their lives. Denver approach, Atlantic 1382 Heavy, descending through flight level 280, requesting priority handling for security situation, over, Lawrence communicated through the radio. Atlantic 1382 Heavy, Denver approach. Priority handling approved. Descend and maintain flight level 200. Expect vectors for ILS approach runway 16R, the controller responded immediately. Lawrence glanced at Elijah. They're clearing traffic for us. Elijah nodded, focused on reprogramming the flight management system for the new approach. His mind compartmentalized the tasks at hand, the technical aspects of flying the aircraft safely took precedence over the career implications that loomed on the horizon. What exactly happened out there? Lawrence asked as they descended through 25,000 feet. 1 minute it's a passenger complaint, the next we have an air marshal making an arrest. Maxwell escalated from racist comments to physical confrontation, Elijah replied tersely. Then he shouted, hijacking, and tried to rush the cockpit. That crosses every red line in aviation security. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Look, I'm not defending the guy, but maybe if we just let the cabin crew handle it. Then what? Elijah challenged, looking directly at his co-pilot for the first time since returning to the cockpit. Maxwell continues harassing black passengers. Makes more racist comments. Where's the line, Lawrence? When does it become worth addressing? The question hung in the air between them. Lawrence had no ready answer, having never had to consider where that line might be. For him, such incidents were theoretical dilemmas. For Elijah, they were lived reality. I've got company on the line, Lawrence said instead, gesturing to the satellite communication system that was signaling an incoming call from Atlantic Airways headquarters. Elijah took a deep breath. Put them through. The tense voice of Operations Director Patricia Winters filled the cockpit. Captain Thompson, we've been notified of a security incident requiring diversion. What's your status? We're 20 minutes from landing in Denver, Elijah reported. Air Marshal has restrained a disruptive passenger who made racist comments, physically confronted other passengers, and falsely claimed hijacking while attempting to access the cockpit. There was a pause before Winters responded. The passenger is Benjamin Maxwell. The fact that she already knew the passenger's name confirmed Elijah's suspicion that Maxwell's connections were already at work behind the scenes. That's correct, Elijah confirmed. I have CEO Blackwell requesting details, Winters continued, her voice carefully neutral. He's personally concerned about this situation. Of course he was. Elijah could imagine Blackwell already weighing the competing interests, his golf buddy's dignity versus the airline's public image and legal exposure. All actions taken were in accordance with FAA regulations and company security protocols, Elijah stated firmly. The Air Marshal has body camera footage of the entire incident. This last point was something Elijah had just realized might be critically important. If Chen had activated her body camera, there would be objective evidence of Maxwell's behavior. Understood, Winters replied. Denver Airport security and local police have been notified. They'll meet the aircraft at Gate A36. Mr. Blackwell and General Counsel Sanders are en route via corporate jet. They'll arrive approximately 1 hour after you land. The implications were clear. This wasn't being treated as a routine security incident but as a high-priority corporate crisis. The swift response from the highest levels of Atlantic Airways suggested the competing narratives were already being formed. As Lawrence continued handling communications with air traffic control, Elijah's mind flashed back to similar crisis situations he'd managed during his Air Force career. Flying combat support missions in Desert Storm, he'd once landed a damaged C-130 on a partially destroyed runway while under missile threat. Compared to that, this should have been straightforward. Yet in some ways, this situation felt more precarious, not because of physical danger, but because the battlefield was political and social rather than military. In the cabin, Gabriella was methodically documenting the incident, taking statements from witnesses while Air Marshal Chen maintained custody of Maxwell. Dr. Washington had organized several passengers to record their accounts of what they'd observed, recognizing the importance of preserving contemporaneous evidence. Judge Foster was quietly explaining to others nearby that falsely claiming hijacking on an aircraft was a federal offense with serious penalties, regardless of the passenger's social connections or wealth. The Wilson family was keeping their son close, the father explaining in hushed tones what they were witnessing, not just a security incident, but a moment where systemic privilege was being directly challenged. As the aircraft descended through 10,000 feet, Elijah executed a perfect approach to Denver International Airport. The massive front range of the Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, a reminder of the immovable forces that shaped the landscape, not unlike the deeply entrenched social hierarchies that Maxwell had expected to protect him from consequences. Atlantic 1382 Heavy, cleared to land runway 16R. Emergency services standing by, the tower controller informed them. Cleared to land 16R, Atlantic 1382 Heavy, Lawrence confirmed. Elijah guided the aircraft toward the runway with the precision that had defined his career. Despite everything that had transpired, his technical performance remained flawless, a fact that would be recorded in the flight data recorders and potentially relevant to whatever investigation followed. The touchdown was smooth despite gusty crosswinds, a testament to Elijah's skill. As they taxied toward the gate, he could see the flashing lights of police vehicles and airport security waiting on the tarmac. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson," Elijah announced over the PA system. "We have arrived safely in Denver. Due to the security incident, local authorities will be boarding the aircraft first. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until instructed otherwise. We apologize for the inconvenience and thank you for your cooperation during this challenging situation." What Elijah couldn't see was the activity already unfolding at Atlantic Airways headquarters. CEO Richard Blackwell was on his private jet, receiving real-time updates that painted conflicting pictures of the incident. Maxwell had somehow managed to place a call to Blackwell's personal assistant from the air phone before being restrained, claiming racial harassment and threatening a lawsuit that would destroy the airline's reputation. Meanwhile, social media was already buzzing with partial information. A passenger in the main cabin had tweeted about an incident in first class and mentioned police meeting the plane in Denver. Aviation blogs were speculating about the nature of the security threat, and Atlantic Airways' stock price had dipped slightly on the news of an unscheduled diversion. As the aircraft door opened and Denver police boarded to take custody of Maxwell, Elijah remained in the cockpit completing the shutdown checklist. His future hung in the balance, but his focus remained on his immediate professional responsibilities. Shutting down the aircraft systems methodically, ensuring all technical aspects of the flight were properly documented. Lauren sat silently beside him, the enormity of what had transpired finally seeming to register. "They're going to make this about you, aren't they?" he said quietly. "Not about what Maxwell did." Elijah paused briefly before responding. "They usually do." The statement contained 3 decades of experience navigating a system where standing up against discrimination often came with higher costs for the person who spoke out than for the perpetrator. As Elijah signed the last entry in the aircraft logbook, he wondered whether this time might be different, or whether the same old patterns would reassert themselves once the immediate crisis passed. "Do you think the airline executives will stand by their captain or protect their wealthy passenger?" Comment number 1 if you believe justice will prevail, or number 2 if you think corporate interests will win out. Subscribe now to see the shocking turn of events in our next segment. What would you risk to stand up for what's right? And how do we create a world where people like Maxwell face real consequences for their actions? 3 hours after landing in Denver, Elijah sat in a sterile conference room at the airport's administrative offices. The windowless space, with its generic corporate furniture and buzzing fluorescent lights, seemed designed to drain the energy from its occupants. Elijah maintained perfect posture in his captain's uniform, though he'd removed his hat and placed it on the table before him. Across from him sat CEO Richard Blackwell, a man whose carefully cultivated silver hair and bespoke suit projected the image Atlantic Airways wanted for its leadership: polished, traditional, and unmistakably establishment. Beside Blackwell was Patricia Winters, the operations director whose tense voice Elijah had heard on the radio earlier. Rounding out the airline's contingent was General Counsel James Sanders, whose expression suggested he was already calculating potential liability rather than determining facts. "Captain Thompson," Blackwell began, his tone measured but cool, "we've reviewed the preliminary reports, and frankly, we have concerns about how this situation was handled." Elijah kept his expression neutral. "In what specific way, sir?" "You left the cockpit to address a passenger complaint personally," Blackwell stated. "That's unusual protocol. Cabin crews are trained to handle passenger issues. FAA regulations permit pilots to leave the cockpit during cruise portions of flight when necessary," Elijah replied evenly. The situation had escalated to the point where it potentially threatened cabin safety and order. Sanders leaned forward. "The question isn't whether you could leave the cockpit, Captain, but whether you should have. Mr. Maxwell is claiming you targeted him specifically and escalated what was a minor customer service issue. Mr. Maxwell was making explicitly racist comments about other passengers," Elijah stated. That constitutes harassment under our own passenger code of conduct. Blackwell shifted uncomfortably. Ben can be outspoken after a few drinks. Perhaps his comments were misinterpreted or taken out of context. There are too many black people in first class seems fairly clear in any context, sir, Elijah responded, allowing a hint of edge to enter his voice for the first time. Patricia Winters, who had been reviewing notes on her tablet, looked up. We have conflicting accounts. Some passengers support your version of events, while others say Mr. Maxwell was simply expressing concerns about changing service standards. Have you reviewed the security footage? Elijah asked. There's an issue with the cabin cameras, Sanders interjected quickly. A technical glitch means we only have partial coverage of the incident. A convenient glitch, Elijah thought but didn't say. Air Marshal Chen's body camera should have captured everything. We've requested that footage, but the Transportation Security Administration has its own procedures for releasing such evidence, Sanders replied smoothly. It could be weeks before we have access. Blackwell placed his hands flat on the table in a gesture that suggested finality. Captain Thompson, you have a distinguished service record with Atlantic Airways. 30 years, not a single safety violation. It would be a shame to have that record tarnished by this incident just days before your retirement. The implication was clear. Are you suggesting I resign? Elijah asked directly. We're offering you the opportunity to conclude your career with dignity, Blackwell replied. Full retirement benefits, health coverage as promised, and a confidential separation agreement that protects both your reputation and the airlines. Before Elijah could respond, there was a knock at the conference room door. An administrative assistant entered and whispered something to Winters, who frowned and whispered back. After a brief exchange, the assistant left. Dar. Tamara Washington and Judge William Foster are outside, Winters announced. They're insisting on providing statements about the incident. This meeting is private, Sanders said immediately. Tell them to submit written statements through proper channels. Blackwell nodded in agreement. We need to focus on resolving this situation discreetly, not turning it into more of a spectacle. The dismissal of credible witnesses who could corroborate Elijah's account was telling. This wasn't about determining what had actually happened, it was about damage control. What's happening with Gabriela Rivera? Elijah asked, changing tack. She witnessed the entire incident. Winters and Sanders exchanged glances before Winters responded. Ms. Rivera is currently being debriefed by HR. There are some discrepancies in her incident report that need to be addressed. Discrepancies? Elijah pressed. Her account seems emotionally charged rather than objective, Sanders elaborated. We need clear, factual statements, not interpretations colored by personal feelings. Translation: Gabriela was being pressured to alter her account to align with the narrative the airline preferred. Elijah had seen this pattern before, when incidents involved race, the experiences and perspectives of people of color were often dismissed as emotional or subjective, rather than factual. And Lawrence Reed? Elijah inquired about his co-pilot. What's his statement saying? Captain Reed has provided a balanced account, Blackwell offered. He acknowledges that Mr. Maxwell may have made inappropriate comments but suggests the situation could have been handled without the dramatic escalation to an emergency landing. Of course. Lawrence, who hadn't witnessed most of the incident and had broken protocol himself by leaving the cockpit unattended, was now being held up as the voice of reason. His balanced perspective allowed the airline to acknowledge some wrongdoing by Maxwell while still placing the ultimate responsibility on Elijah for how the situation was handled. Captain Thompson, Blackwell continued, his tone shifting to something almost paternal, you have a choice to make here. You can accept our offer of retirement with full benefits, sign the confidentiality agreement, and move on to the next chapter of your life. Or you can contest this, triggering a formal investigation that will likely extend well beyond your planned retirement date, with an uncertain outcome. The unstated threat hung in the air, fight this, and you might lose everything you've worked for over 3 decades. Elijah looked at each face around the table, recognizing the same institutional dynamics he'd navigated his entire career. The system was designed to protect itself. To preserve the comfort of those who benefited from the status quo while making resistance costly for those who challenged it. "I'll need time to consider my options," Elijah finally stated. Of course, Blackwell agreed, relief evident in his voice. "Take 24 hours. The paperwork will be ready when you decide." As the meeting concluded and Elijah left the conference room, he found the airport corridor strangely quiet. Most passengers had been rebooked on other flights to San Francisco, the original aircraft had been returned to service with a different crew, and the media presence that had gathered earlier had been confined to a designated area far from the administrative offices. In this momentary solitude, Elijah checked his phone for the first time since landing. 27 missed calls, dozens of text messages, and countless notifications from social media platforms he rarely used. As he scrolled through them, certain patterns emerged. His daughter Zara had called repeatedly, clearly having heard about the incident. The flight attendants' union had reached out offering support. And most surprisingly, multiple news outlets were requesting interviews. One notification in particular caught his attention. A Twitter hashtag #IStandWithCaptainThompson was trending nationally. Somehow, despite the airline's attempts to control the narrative, the story had broken through. As Elijah walked toward the airport hotel where he'd been booked for the night, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Washington. "Dr. Washington," he answered, "I appreciate your attempt to provide a statement earlier." "Captain Thompson," her voice was clear and determined, "they're trying to bury this. Judge Foster and I were practically escorted out by security when we insisted on speaking to the investigation team." "I'm not surprised," Elijah replied, finding a quiet corner of the lobby to continue the conversation. "Listen carefully," Washington continued, lowering her voice slightly. "We've gathered statements from 12 passengers who witnessed everything. The Wilson family has footage of Maxwell's racist comments before you even came out of the cockpit. And Judge Foster has already contacted colleagues at the Department of Transportation about the handling of this incident." For the first time since the confrontation began, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps the truth would actually matter. "There's more," Washington added. "Air Marshal Chen contacted me discreetly. She's being pressured to emphasize Maxwell's disruptive behavior while downplaying the racist elements of the incident. But she's unwilling to edit her official report." "That's significant," Elijah acknowledged. "Captain," Washington's tone grew even more serious, "they're going to offer you a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. If you sign it, this all goes away. Maxwell faces no real consequences, the airline avoids addressing systemic issues, and the next black pilot who faces this situation will be right back at square one." The weight of the decision before him pressed down on Elijah's shoulders. Fighting this would come at personal cost. Potential loss of benefits, legal expenses, public scrutiny, and the peace he'd hoped would characterize his retirement years. Accepting the settlement would provide financial security and a quiet exit from a career that had often been more challenging than it should have been. "I need to make some calls," Elijah finally said. "Starting with my daughter." "Understood," Washington replied. "But know this, you're not alone this time. Whatever you decide, there are people ready to stand with you." As Elijah ended the call, he looked across the airport lobby and spotted Gabriela Rivera sitting alone at the hotel bar, still in her flight attendant uniform, staring into an untouched glass of water. Their eyes met briefly, two professionals who had tried to uphold both their duties and their dignity, now facing the consequences of refusing to participate in the familiar dance of accommodation and silence. The next 24 hours would determine not just the conclusion of Elijah's career, but what kind of example he would set for those who would come after him. Would he take the path of least resistance, as he had sometimes done in the past? Or would he finally draw a line that couldn't be crossed, regardless of the cost? 1 week after the Denver diversion, Elijah Thompson sat in a corner booth of an anonymous diner 5 miles from Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The location had been chosen for its lack of connection to airline employees or corporate executives, neutral ground for a meeting that could determine the course of his future. Across from him sat Diane Chen, still in her business attire but without the badge and authority she displayed on Flight 1382. As an air marshal, Chen operated under Transportation Security Administration jurisdiction, not airline authority, giving her a degree of independence in this situation. "I shouldn't be doing this," Chen said quietly, glancing around the nearly empty restaurant. "But I've been in law enforcement for 15 years, and I've seen too many incidents get buried because the people involved have connections." "I appreciate the risk you're taking," Elijah acknowledged. Chen reached into her bag and removed a small USB drive, sliding it across the table. "My body camera was active from the moment Maxwell began making threats. It captured everything, his racist comments, his physical intimidation, his false claim of hijacking, everything. TSA is processing the official evidence, but this is my personal backup." Elijah stared at the small device. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because the system is already working to protect Maxwell," Chen replied. "Yesterday, I was informed that the federal charges are being reduced from aircraft interference to simple disorderly conduct, a misdemeanor with a small fine. Someone made calls to the right people." The booth's vinyl seat creaked as Lawrence Reed slid in beside Chen, surprising both of them with his unexpected arrival. "Sorry I'm late," Lawrence said, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Denver traffic was worse than I expected." Elijah hadn't expected his co-pilot to show up. Their last interaction in Denver had been brief and awkward, with Lawrence offering a half-hearted, "Good luck with whatever you decide," before they parted ways. "Lawrence," Elijah acknowledged, his tone neutral. "Didn't know you were invited." "I invited myself," Lawrence replied. "After seeing how the company's handling this, I couldn't stay on the sidelines." Chen looked between them. "You're the co-pilot?" Lawrence nodded. "I've flown with Elijah for 8 years. And I've never seen him act unprofessionally or make a decision that wasn't by the book." "You left the cockpit unattended," Elijah reminded him, the one clear violation of protocol during the entire incident. Lawrence winced. "I know. That's on me, not you. And I've stated that clearly in my updated statement to the investigation team." "Updated statement?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "My first statement was diplomatic," Lawrence admitted. "I tried to avoid taking sides. But after seeing how they're trying to twist everything, I submitted a more detailed account yesterday. Made it clear that you followed proper procedures and that Maxwell was the aggressor." This was unexpected. In Elijah's experience, white colleagues rarely risk their own standing to support a black colleague in situations involving race. "Why?" Elijah asked simply. Lawrence looked down at his hands. "Because I've been thinking about all the times over the years when I've seen little comments, microaggressions, passed over promotions, things that didn't affect me directly so I didn't get involved. Watching them try to railroad you after 30 years of perfect service, it's wrong. And this time, I can't just look the other way." Chen nodded approvingly before turning back to Elijah. "There's more you should know. The airline's internal emails about this incident were leaked to me by someone in their IT department. They reveal a clear bias in how the investigation is being conducted." She placed a folder on the table containing printouts of email exchanges between CEO Blackwell, General Counsel Sanders, and several board members. The messages showed a coordinated effort to minimize Maxwell's behavior while scrutinizing every aspect of Elijah's response for potential policy violations. One email from Blackwell was particularly damning: "We need to handle this carefully. Maxwell's development company is finalizing leases for our Dallas operations center. A discrimination claim from him, valid or not, could complicate several strategic partnerships." As Elijah reviewed the documents, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Gabriela Rivera. He excused himself to take it outside the diner. Elijah, Gabriella's voice was strained but resolute. They fired me this morning. Said I violated company policy by discussing an ongoing investigation with outside parties. Gabriella, I'm sorry, don't be, she cut him off. They offered me a severance package with an NDA. I told them where they could put it. I've already spoken to 3 news outlets about what really happened on that flight. And I'm not stopping there. While Elijah was still processing this information, another call came through, his daughter Zara. Dad, she began without preamble, Dr. Washington contacted me. She's organized a group of black physicians who frequently fly Atlantic Airways to speak out about discrimination they've experienced. They're calling for a boycott until the airline addresses what happened to you properly. The resistance was growing organically, spreading beyond what Elijah could have orchestrated himself. By the time he returned to the booth, Lawrence had more news to share. The pilots' forums are blowing up about this, he reported. Your service record and decorated military background are being circulated. There's talk of solidarity actions if the airline doesn't handle this fairly. Chen added, an investigative journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has been digging into Maxwell's history. Apparently, this isn't the first time he's made racist complaints about service professionals. There are at least 3 documented incidents at hotels and restaurants in the past 2 years. As they continued sharing information, Judge Foster called to report that he had filed a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation regarding Atlantic Airways' handling of the incident and Maxwell's behavior. The Wilson family had appeared on a morning news program, their teenage son eloquently describing how meaningful it was to see Captain Thompson stand up against discrimination. By the time their impromptu strategy session concluded 3 hours later, it was clear that what had begun as an isolated incident was evolving into something larger, a flashpoint in the ongoing struggle for dignity and equal treatment in spaces where discriminatory attitudes persisted despite surface-level progress. That evening, as Elijah watched news coverage of the growing controversy, his phone rang again. The caller ID displayed Atlantic Airways Legal Department. Steeling himself, he answered. Captain Thompson, the crisp voice of General Counsel Sanders greeted him. I hope you've had time to consider our offer. I have, Elijah confirmed. Excellent. I should inform you that the terms have been enhanced. The board has authorized a confidential settlement that includes full retirement benefits, health coverage for life, and a significant one-time payment in exchange for your agreement not to discuss this matter publicly. The amount Sanders named was substantial, enough to secure Elijah's financial future and provide a cushion for Zara as well. The temptation to accept was real. After 30 years of fighting uphill battles, wouldn't it be reasonable to take the money and find peace? The paperwork can be signed tomorrow, Sanders continued, clearly sensing Elijah's contemplation. This all goes away, and you can enjoy your retirement without the stress of public scrutiny or prolonged legal proceedings. Elijah thought about the USB drive from Chen, the leaked emails, the support from unexpected allies, and the young faces watching to see what he would do. Most of all, he thought about that moment in the aircraft when he'd locked eyes with the Wilson boy, the unspoken question about whether things had really changed, whether standing up for yourself was worth the inevitable backlash. Mr. Sanders, Elijah finally responded, his decision made, I appreciate the offer, but I won't be signing any non-disclosure agreement. I believe there are matters of principle at stake here that transcend financial considerations. There was a lengthy silence before Sanders spoke again, his tone noticeably cooler. That's disappointing, Captain Thompson. You should understand that without an agreement, the company will vigorously defend its reputation and the actions of its management. This could become quite unpleasant for all involved. I'm aware of the potential consequences, Elijah replied steadily. I've spent my career calculating risks and making decisions based on the best available information. This is no different. After the call ended, Elijah sat quietly in his apartment, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. The path ahead would be challenging, possible legal battles, public scrutiny, the stress of revisiting painful experiences. But for perhaps the first time in his professional life, he wasn't facing these challenges alone. A coalition had formed organically around principles of dignity and fair treatment, transcending the isolated incident on Flight 1382 to address deeper patterns of discrimination that persisted in supposedly post-racial spaces. As midnight approached, Elijah received a text message from Dr. Washington. Just heard Maxwell's business partners are distancing themselves. 2 board members have expressed concerns about his behavior. The tide may be turning. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps this would be yet another moment of apparent progress that ultimately reinforced existing power structures. Either way, Elijah Thompson had made his choice. After decades of calculated compromises in the name of career survival, he had finally drawn a line that couldn't be crossed. Not for money, not for peace, not even for the retirement he had earned through 30 years of exemplary service. Whatever came next, he would face it standing tall, just as he had in the cockpit of Flight 1382 when he'd chosen dignity over accommodation, principle over pragmatism, and the future over the past. 6 months after Flight 1382's fateful diversion to Denver, Elijah Thompson walked through the gleaming headquarters of Atlantic Airways in downtown Atlanta. His reflection in the polished marble floors showed a man transformed, not in his fundamental character, which had always been resolute, but in his external presentation. Gone was the pilot's uniform with its 4 captain's stripes. Instead, Elijah wore a tailored charcoal suit with the Atlantic Airways executive pin on his lapel. The journey to this moment had been neither straightforward nor guaranteed. When Elijah had rejected the airline settlement offer and non-disclosure agreement, he had stepped into uncertain territory. What followed was a 6-month saga that had transformed not just his own circumstances but the culture of Atlantic Airways itself. 2 weeks after his refusal to sign the NDA, the USB drive from Air Marshal Chen had found its way to major news outlets. The unedited footage showed Maxwell's behavior in stark, undeniable terms. His racist comments, physical aggression, and false claims of hijacking were broadcast nationwide. Public opinion shifted dramatically overnight. Simultaneously, the email leaks revealed the airline's internal deliberations about protecting Maxwell due to his business connections rather than upholding their own anti-discrimination policies. The scandal deepened when investigative journalists uncovered Maxwell's history of similar complaints at hotels, restaurants, and other airlines, a pattern of entitled behavior that had previously been settled quietly through his connections. A lawsuit filed by Elijah with support from Judge Foster had exposed systemic discrimination within Atlantic Airways. The discovery process revealed that black pilots had been promoted at rates far below their white counterparts despite equal or superior performance evaluations. The airline had settled the suit rather than face a public trial, but the settlement came with unprecedented conditions beyond financial compensation, structural changes to hiring, promotion, and anti-discrimination enforcement. Maxwell's business empire had crumbled in the aftermath. As footage of his behavior went viral, commercial tenants began terminating their leases with his development company. Financial institutions reviewed their relationships with him. The country club that had been his social headquarters quietly revoked his membership. His attempts to portray himself as the victim backfired spectacularly when former employees came forward with additional accounts of discriminatory behavior. CEO Richard Blackwell had resigned in disgrace after additional leaked communications showed a pattern of dismissing discrimination complaints across the company. Lawrence Reed had testified against the airline in Elijah's lawsuit, describing the subtle ways in which qualified minority candidates had been passed over for promotions. The courage he'd found after years of silent complicity had cost him the chief pilot position but earned him something more valuable: the respect of colleagues who had never expected him to take such a stand. The boardroom Elijah now entered as Atlantic Airways' new executive vice president of diversity, inclusion, and corporate culture bore little resemblance to the tense conference room in Denver where he'd been pressured to resign 6 months earlier. Half the board members were new, brought in after shareholders demanded accountability. The atmosphere was different. More transparent, more willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the company's culture. "Good morning, everyone," Elijah greeted the assembled executives. "Today marks an important milestone in our transformation journey." The quarterly leadership meeting was Elijah's first major presentation since accepting the newly created executive position, a role with actual authority and resources rather than the symbolic diversity positions so common in corporate America. His appointment had made national news, not just for its unprecedented nature but for what it represented, a tangible consequence of standing up against discrimination. "The first phase of our comprehensive diversity audit is complete," Elijah continued, displaying the results on the screen behind him. "The data confirms what many employees of color have experienced anecdotally: significant disparities in hiring, promotion, and retention across all departments. There was a time when such direct acknowledgement of racism within the company would have been met with defensive pushback or uncomfortable silence. Today, the executives nodded in sober recognition. The lawsuits, media coverage, and customer boycotts had forced a reckoning that mere moral arguments had failed to achieve for decades." After the meeting, Elijah made his way to the Flight Operations Center where a small ceremony was taking place. Gabriela Rivera, reinstated with back pay and promoted to head of cabin crew training, was welcoming a new class of flight attendants, the most diverse in the airline's history. "The face of aviation is changing," Gabriela told the trainees as Elijah entered. "And Atlantic Airways is finally catching up to reality. No longer will we expect our crew members to tolerate discrimination for the sake of customer convenience." When she spotted Elijah, Gabriela paused to acknowledge him. The trainees applauded spontaneously. Many had applied specifically because of the changes his stand had prompted throughout the industry. Later that afternoon, Elijah met with Dr. Tamara Washington, who had been appointed to chair the airline's new Passenger Experience Advisory Council, a group tasked with reviewing and revising policies that had often placed the comfort of certain passengers above the dignity of others. "The customer satisfaction metrics since implementing the new anti-discrimination enforcement protocols are fascinating," Dr. Washington shared, showing Elijah the data. "Contrary to fears about alienating passengers, our overall ratings have increased by 7%. Turns out most people prefer flying with an airline that takes a clear stand against racism." As they reviewed the numbers, Elijah noticed a young black pilot walking through the operations center, his new uniform crisp and his expression earnest. With a start, Elijah recognized him, Wilson's son from Flight 1382, now in the company's expanded cadet program that Elijah had established to create pathways for underrepresented groups in aviation. "Michael," Elijah called out. "A moment, please." The young man approached respectfully. "Mr. Thompson, sir. It's an honor." "How are you finding the program?" Elijah asked. "Challenging, sir. But in the right ways." Michael's eyes shone with determination. "My dad sends his regards. He says what happened that day changed my life." "Changed all our lives," Elijah acknowledged. "How's the simulator training going?" "Just completed my first emergency procedures assessment yesterday. Instructor said it was one of the best performances he'd seen from a cadet." Elijah smiled. "Not surprised. Keep that focus, and you'll have your wings before you know it." After Michael continued on his way, Dr. Washington observed, "That's the real victory, isn't it? Not just policy changes or settlements, but creating paths for the next generation." Elijah nodded. "It's why I ultimately accepted this position instead of simply retiring. The satisfaction of proving Maxwell and his enablers wrong is fleeting. Building something better in the aftermath, that's the work that matters." Later that evening, Elijah visited Atlantic Airways' primary hub at Hartsfield-Jackson. Unlike 6 months ago, when he'd moved through the airport feeling isolated despite his captain's uniform, today he was recognized by crew members and passengers alike. Some offered quiet nods of respect, others approached to express gratitude for his stand. At Gate A17, Elijah paused to watch the departure of Flight 1382, the same route number, Atlanta to San Francisco. Through the large windows, he could see the cockpit where Captain Diana Chen, a talented Asian American pilot whose promotion had previously been delayed multiple times, was conducting pre-flight checks. Beside her sat First Officer Trevor Wilson, an accomplished black pilot who had been flying for Atlantic for 8 years before finally receiving advancement opportunities under the new system Elijah had helped implement. As he observed them working together with practiced efficiency, Elijah thought about the sequence of events that had led to this moment. The blood mentioned in the opening hook, the detail that had initially captured attention, had indeed been real. During the physical confrontation on the aircraft, Maxwell had swung wildly at Elijah, missed, and struck his nose against an overhead bin, resulting in the blood that had spattered Elijah's uniform. The image of Elijah standing over an unconscious Maxwell had been manufactured by Maxwell's legal team in early press statements, attempting to portray the captain as the aggressor. The truth, captured on Air Marshal Chen's body camera and witness recordings, had eventually prevailed. But Elijah knew well that truth alone was rarely sufficient in these battles. It had taken courage from multiple individuals. Chen risking her career, Lawrence finally finding his voice, Gabriella refusing the NDA, Dr. Washington organizing the boycott, to create enough pressure for actual change. As Flight 1382 pushed back from the gate, Elijah turned to find Lawrence Reed watching him from a few feet away. "Still feels strange not being in the cockpit, doesn't it?" Lawrence asked, approaching. "Every day," Elijah admitted. "But this work matters too." Lawrence, who had accepted a position as a standards captain responsible for training the next generation of pilots, nodded in agreement. "Different kind of flying now. Higher altitude, broader view." "Speaking of views," Elijah said, "Zara's hosting a dinner next weekend. She specifically asked if you and Karen would come." Lawrence smiled. "We'd be honored." As they walked together through the terminal, Elijah reflected on the cost of standing up, the stress, the uncertainty, the risk. But also on the far greater cost of staying silent, a cost he had paid too many times before in his career. The confrontation on Flight 1382 had been 30 years in the making, the accumulated pressure of 1,000 small accommodations finally finding release in one unequivocal no. "You know what I tell the new cadets when they ask about that day?" Lawrence said, interrupting Elijah's thoughts. "What's that?" "That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." Lawrence paused. "That's what you did, Elijah. You were scared, we all were, but you did it anyway." Elijah nodded, accepting the truth in Lawrence's words. He had been scared. Of losing his pension. Of being labeled a troublemaker. Of having his exemplary career reduced to a single controversial incident. What had changed wasn't the fear, but his willingness to let that fear determine his actions. "The world changes one flight at a time," Elijah replied, echoing something his late wife Diana had often told him. "One stand at a time. One person finding their voice." As they reached the exit, Elijah turned for one last look at the departure boards, the choreographed dance of arrivals and departures continuing as it always had. The aviation industry remained largely as it was, planes still flew, schedules were still maintained, passengers still traveled from point A to point B. Yet something fundamental had shifted, not just at Atlantic Airways but throughout an industry that had been forced to confront its uncomfortable truths. It wasn't complete transformation, such changes never are, but it was meaningful progress, the kind that creates space for more voices, more dignity, more humanity in spaces where these had too often been in short supply. What do you think? Would you have had the courage to stand up like Captain Thompson did, even at the risk of losing everything you've worked for? Comment below with your thoughts. If you believe more people should hear this powerful story of standing against discrimination, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support helps us continue bringing important stories like this one to light. Thank you for watching, and remember, real change happens when ordinary people choose extraordinary courage. Captain Thompson's story teaches us that systemic change often begins with a single act of courage. For 30 years, Elijah made calculated compromises to survive in an industry that marginalized him. But when faced with blatant racism that affected not just him but others, he finally drew a line, not knowing if anyone would stand with him. The true power of this story lies in how individual courage inspired collective action. Air Marshal Chen, Dr. Washington, Judge Foster, Lawrence Reed, and Gabriela Rivera each made their own decisions to support justice rather than convenience. Their combined voices created momentum that institutional power couldn't suppress. This story also reveals how discrimination persists in supposedly elite spaces. First-class cabins, executive boardrooms, and professional environments often maintain invisible barriers through cultural expectations about who belongs. When these barriers are challenged, the system typically responds by isolating and discrediting the challenger. Perhaps most importantly, Thompson's journey demonstrates that meaningful change requires sacrifice. Comfort, security, and peace are powerful incentives to remain silent. By rejecting the settlement and NDA, Thompson chose principle over personal benefit, a choice that created opportunity for others like Michael Wilson. True progress isn't measured by diversity statistics or policy documents, but by whether people feel safe asserting their dignity without fear of punishment. Thompson's legacy wasn't just diversifying one airline, but creating space for everyone to breathe more freely. Has there been a moment in your life when you witnessed discrimination and had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent? What did you choose, and how did it affect you? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might give someone else the courage they need today. If Captain Thompson's journey resonated with you, please hit that like button to help more people discover this important story. The conversation about dignity and respect in public spaces affects all of us, regardless of our background. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about everyday heroes who stand up against injustice, even when it would be easier to look away. These aren't just stories. They're blueprints for creating the world we want to live in. Share this video with someone who might need encouragement to find their voice or who works in an environment where these conversations need to happen. Together, we can create spaces where dignity isn't a privilege for some but a right for all. Thank you for being part of this journey. Remember, change happens one flight at a time, one stand at a time, one person finding their voice. What will your contribution be?